Hey there, it's Dr. Vivian Lowe, and you're on VLMD Rounds, a podcast on medical science and tools to optimize your health. Welcome back. As some of you know, I am an obesity specialist, and really one of the frustrations in treating patients with obesity all these years has been that people tend to just focus on weight. And if you know me by now, you'll know that I really like to look at the body composition. So I define obesity by fat mass and also fat dysfunction. But there's one other aspect of obesity that gets missed all the time, and that really is the nutrient deficiencies that come along with obesity. So anytime I see a new patient, I always have top of my mind, besides the fat mass and fat dysfunction and the rest of the body composition, I'm also worried about the nutrient deficiencies that this patient likely has. And we forget about that, and we just focus often on the weight alone. And when we do talk about nutrients in the context of obesity, because again, we are focused on weight, then, maybe we'll touch on the different macronutrients. So people will talk about the different amounts of carbohydrates and proteins and fats and what sort of optimal, kind of breakdown in those different macronutrients would be good for patients. But we really don't get into much of a discussion on the micronutrients. And similarly, when we talk about metabolic health, when we discuss metabolic syndrome, again, the discussion, if we get down to dietary recommendations, there's a lot of debate about whether we should be focusing just on counting calories or also taking into account the different macronutrient breakdowns. And here again, you don't hear very much about the micronutrients. And yet, these nutrient deficiencies may have a direct role in obesity and a direct role in metabolic dysfunction. So today, I'd just like to talk about one micronutrient, and it's just a general survey. But the idea here is to try to bring to your attention how these micronutrients can really have an important role in our metabolism. Let's go. Well, the micronutrient I am focusing on is vitamin A today. So vitamin A, really technically, when we say vitamin A, we're referring to all trans retinol products, okay? And essentially there are three vitamins of vitamin A, or three physiologically active forms of vitamin A. And these would be retinol, which is an alcohol, retinal, so retinal, and that's the aldehyde form. And we also have retinoic acid, which clearly is the acidic form. All right, so when we talk about, vitamin A, we refer to these groups of metabolites from vitamin A, and we can collectively call them retinoids. Now, when we say retinoids, though, just to be complete, technically we also include synthetic products, right, that are sort of vitamin A derived. Okay, so when you say retinoids, you technically will be including those synthetic products as well. I'm not really going to be talking about any of the synthetic forms of vitamin A. All right, vitamin A, it's fat soluble, and we don't discuss it very often, but it's really important for embryogenesis, for development, cell differentiation, reproduction, really important for immune function and immune regulation, hematopoiesis, vision, of course, and also neuronal growth. What people don't recognize is that it's also a very important regulator of adipose tissue. Now, animals like ourselves, we can't make vitamin A, and so we have to get it from our diet in different forms. So we can get it in animal sources of the diet, like in fish or animal liver, for example. And then you hear people talk about getting it from fruits and vegetables, particularly in the form of carotenoids. And these are substances that we get from fruits and vegetables that are, reddish and orangey in color. And they include something called beta-carotene. And when you say beta-carotene, a lot of times people say, oh, vitamin A. But beta-carotene is not vitamin A. It is a precursor. So you could call it vitamin A, but it's not really vitamin A yet. It's the precursor to vitamin A, and it needs to be converted through enzymes to become active vitamin A. So the way that happens is generally this beta-carotene is converted via the enzyme beta-carotene monooxygenase 1 or BCMO1, and this will bring it eventually to retinoic acid. Okay. Now, when you look at conversion tables for beta-carotene to retinoic acid, there's a huge range, and the reason for this is it's not really very predictable. In general, you'll see that people use maybe the 12 micrograms of the beta-carotene being equivalent to 1 microgram of vitamin A. And that's just a very, very broad guesstimate. Can't really kind of pin down a specific number because it's going to vary depending on the person, depending on the individual. It's also going to vary depending on how you get it in the diet, okay? So with beta-carotene, it's been reported that the optimal absorption of beta-carotene with cooked vegetables would be with 2.4 to 5 grams of fat per meal, right? And it turns out, maybe with cooked vegetables, it's not that important, but it certainly is important when you're consuming raw vegetables, things like salads, okay? With those, it's been seen that dressings that have about 28 grams of fat have really given much increased uptake of that beta-carotene as compared to using dressings with maybe 6 grams of fat. So with the raw vegetables, with the salads, you kind of need a good amount of fat for that beta-carotene to be absorbed. Now, unintuitively, it turns out that the higher your dose of the beta-carotene, the lower the conversion to vitamin A. Okay, so generally we think that, well, if you give a higher dose, so people go, well, yeah, I know it's not really active vitamin A, but if you give a higher dose, then you kind of make up for it and you'll be fine. But it turns out that actually the higher the dose, the less the conversion to vitamin A. So it can get very tricky. Now, in terms of the vitamin A equivalency ratios, that can range from about 2 to 55 when you're just giving pure beta-carotene, let's say in an oil supplement, okay? And it's different when you give it in the form of, let's say, plants, when you're actually eating the plants, right? So at low dose beta-carotene supplements, the vitamin, and by low dose, we mean that less than or equal to 6 milligrams, the vitamin A equivalents would be 2 to 1 or 9 to 1, okay? So again, there's a range. Now, with plant sources, if you're getting it from plant sources in the diet, not through a supplement, the ratio is about 4-1 to about 28-1, or maybe 30-1, okay? So you can see big range, unable to predict what it actually is in the patient. So I rarely ever use beta-carotene, as a source of vitamin A supplementation for my patients. And if they're consuming beta-carotene in the diet, I still don't really know how much active vitamin A that patient is getting. All right. Now, as I said, you get it from the diet either in preformed bioactive form, the retinol esters, or you get it in the provitamin precursor form in the form of beta-carotene. All right. And the beta-carotene will eventually get converted to retinol in the intestines, but they can also be absorbed as beta-carotene. So these retinol esters from the animal sources and the beta-carotene, they all get packaged into chylomicrons. And you remember, these are the lipoproteins that are found in the intestines. And now we transport fats, cholesterol, and also fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin A, right, to different parts of the body. So that's one way in which your vitamin A gets, taken up to different parts of the body. And the plasma concentration of retinol is tightly regulated. So it ranges between 2 to 3 micromoles in humans. Now, this retinol, eventually, when it gets into the cell, right, it has to be converted to retinoic acid. So when the retinol enters into the cell, converted to retinoic acid, once we have that happen, that retinoic acid is now able to enter the nucleus and regulate gene transcription. And that's the important thing about vitamin A, right? It's really a master regulator of gene transcription. So it can help activate, turn on and turn off different genes that are involved in growth, in development, in immune regulation, in metabolism. Very wide-ranging effects. In order to do that, it really has to be able to access the nucleus, and it does so in the form of retinoic acid. As I said, when we absorbed the vitamin A from the intestines, they were kind of packaged into the chylomicrons and taken to different parts of the body. However, once you have the retinoic acid, let's say that's in the liver, right? To take that vitamin A from the liver, which is where most of your vitamin A is stored, 80 to 90% of your vitamin A is stored in the liver. I mentioned this in the episode on fatty liver. It's those hepatic stellate cells that are really involved in storage of vitamin A in lipid droplets, okay? Now, when you need vitamin A, you need more vitamin A, you take that retinoic acid and you convert it back to retinol, and now it has to be shipped out of the liver to other tissues. And it does so by being bound to different retinol binding proteins, or RBPs, all in caps, okay? Retinol binding proteins. We have different forms of those proteins. So essentially, we take that retinoic acid, convert it back to retinol, bind it to the retinol binding proteins that are made in the liver, and then we can ship it to different tissues for use there. And generally, we think of the liver as the main place where we store the vitamin A. But besides the liver, there's another tissue that's very important for vitamin A storage, and that would be your fat tissue, okay? So I think a lot of times we think about the liver when we think about vitamin A, but really very few people think about adipose tissue or fat when we think about vitamin A, and yet it stores retinol and its different metabolites in the visceral fat and in also our subcutaneous fat. And when you look at those two different deposits of fat in our bodies, they have anywhere from 6.5 to around 7 micrograms of retinol per gram of tissue. Okay, so it's about the same in the visceral fat as in the subcutaneous fat. And that retinol is stored mainly in the free form. 75% of that is stored in its free form, and 25% is stored in the esterified form. And when I say esterified, I mean it's just bound or linked to fatty acids, and now we have a retinol ester. Okay, so you take retinol and you combine it with fatty acids and you make an ester that way. All right, so it turns out that this fat tissue or adipose tissue really plays an active role in vitamin A metabolism, and your white adipose tissue really expresses high levels of retinol binding protein. In particular, when we think about fat tissue, we think about RBP4, okay, retinol binding protein 4. And as I said, this retinol binding protein 4 can bind to retinol, and then it goes out into the bloodstream where it complexes with something called transthyretin, and this forms a big complex, and that's kind of how the vitamin A is transported into different parts of the body. Now, adipocytes or fat cells really have a complete system of enzymes and proteins, all the machinery needed for vitamin A metabolism, all right? And they also have retinoic acid receptors intracellularly, which regulate vitamin A transcription, and therefore the fat cells themselves become targets of vitamin A metabolism and activity. Okay, so there's a tight link between vitamin A metabolism and homeostasis and the fat cell. Now, we know that when someone has obesity, they basically have chronic inflammation going on, right? And with vitamin A, you know, we have a role of vitamin A in immune regulation. So it's important in T cell proliferation and B cell activation. It's also important for regulation of the different types of T cells, T helper cells, Th1, Th2, and the regulatory T cells, also known as Tregs. They, for example, increase phagocytosis in gut-resident macrophages, and they're very important in preserving mucosal integrity, all right? Particularly with the macrophages, I know some of you know I have a thing for macrophages, and if you want a very, very basic overview, you can look up on YouTube a talk I gave called The Magical Mystery Macrophage Tour. And there I talk about the M1 and M2 states of macrophages. And this is really, it doesn't happen in real life, but it's a way to think about macrophage activity. And generally, when we say M1 polarization of macrophages, we're really talking about how the macrophages are now more inflammatory in their activity. And when we talk about M2 macrophages, those are more anti-inflammatory types of macrophages. And tissue-resident macrophages, which are macrophages that are really kind of involved in housekeeping activities in different tissues in your body, those generally tend to be in an M2 state. And we know that if you have more vitamin A, then you can actually convert macrophages into an M2 state or an anti-inflammatory state and make them more like tissue-resident macrophages, which is kind of really nice to know, because a lot of times, we talk about all the ways that we polarize macrophages towards an inflammatory state or an M1 state, and there's not a lot that we can do to kind of put them towards an M2 state. And yet it's been known for quite a while that with vitamin A, we can induce an M2 polarization in those macrophages, so they become more like the tissue resident macrophages, more for homeostasis processes than for pro-inflammatory processes. All right. Now, again, back to obesity, we've seen, and this is the part that I think a lot of people, miss out on, that people with decreased vitamin A intake generally seem to have increased adiposity or increased fatness. All right, this has been noticed for a long period of time. Different groups have seen this, that when you have, whether in animal models or even in humans, right, there's this inverse relationship between vitamin A intake and fatness or adiposity. And we also see there's an inverse relationship between serum retinol and BMI in those with class 3 obesity. And by that, we mean that the BMI is 40 or above, okay? So people with class 3 obesity, there's a very clear inverse relationship, right? That if they have low retinol, then they have higher and higher BMI, okay? And we've also seen that with healthy women, when we look at their fat deposits in the subcutaneous fat and also in the visceral fat, we see generally, a strong expression of the genes for the enzymes that are involved in making retinoic acid from retinol, right? So we have these genes well expressed that are important for vitamin A metabolism. Now, with mice models that have been, that have knockout for this gene, right? So now they have decreased vitamin A metabolism. These mice have impaired liver gluconeogenesis and also decreased fasting glucose. And they also seem to have higher UCP1, uncoupling protein 1 activity in the white adipose tissue. And this essentially means they seem to have a little bit more browning of fat, okay, more browning activity in the white fat. Now, with increased retinoic acid, we have increased transcription of the gene for phosphoenolpyruvate, carboxykinase signaling. And so this might be because when you have increased retinoic acid, then you have increased transcription of genes that are involved in gluconeogenesis. So you have increased production of glucose by the liver when we have higher levels of retinoic acid. So back to those mice that had knockout of retinoic acid production, that they were unable to actually do gluconeogenesis, and that might be why they had impaired glucose levels, fasting glucose levels, and those were actually lower. There have been a lot of studies that have looked at the association with RBP4 in diabetes. Okay, so people noted that with increased retinol binding protein 4, we saw more diabetes in those patients and in those animal models. In 2005, the Kahn lab, Kahn, came out with this landmark study, and what they found was that there was increased RBP4 gene expressed in the adipose tissue of mice that had liver and muscle insulin resistance. All right, so now they discovered that this RBP4, or retinol binding protein 4, is an adipokine because it's secreted by adipose cells, and that this was associated with insulin resistance in different mice models. Now, it turns out that the adipocyte, or the fat tissue, is probably not important as a source of circulating RBP4, because most of that you find in the serum is going to be coming from the liver. Remember, most of your vitamin A is stored in the liver, and the liver makes all these different retinol binding proteins that makes RBP4. Most of the circulating levels of RBP4 are actually from the liver. But with insulin resistance, we think that it's a paracrine effect of adipose RBP4. And this RBP4 from those adipocytes really increase the markers of inflammation in the adipose tissue, and also increase genes for lipases involved in lipolysis. And as a result, you'd have more lipolysis going on, more free fatty acids released into the blood. And free fatty acids, as I've mentioned previously, are very toxic to different tissues, right? So now we generate even more inflammation, and we think that's how the adipocyte is involved in creating more inflammation in the body, this chronic inflammation. One of the mechanisms is through the circulating RBP4 within the tissue itself. We also know that retinoic acid has an inhibitory effect on adipogenesis. So we've seen in various studies that retinoic acid itself doesn't allow the formation of new fat cells, right? It inhibits the formation of new fat cells. Now, with specific rat models of obesity, these rats were found to have polyuria, polydipsia, hyperphagia, increased insulin, increased leptin, and euglycemia. They had increased triacylglycerols in the blood. They had increased visceral fat deposits. They also had increased HDL, and these rats really didn't do very well because they had poor immune function. They were infertile, and they really weren't very healthy. But when we gave these rats a diet that was enriched in vitamin A for 60 days, then they actually lost weight. They decreased fat, right? That weight loss was from the fat, and they had decreased visceral adipose tissue without changing the food intake, right? There was no change in intake of food. Just by enriching the diet with vitamin A for 60 days, they had decrease in weight and fat compared to their counterparts that had just been given a stock diet. Now, high doses of vitamin A really don't affect the size of fat cells. But we see that with lean rats, we had increased apoptosis of those fat cells. More fat cells died when you gave them vitamin A in the diet. And therefore, when the fat cells die, they had decreased fat mass and they lost weight. However, in the obese phenotypes, this did not happen. So we only saw this in the lean rats. Now, in the obese rats, however, what happened was we saw increase again in UCP1 in the brown adipose tissue. So we actually had more brown fat activity, right, in those obese rats when they were given a diet that was enriched with vitamin A. And we didn't see this in the lean rats. And this is maybe because the lean rats were already at the maximal, rate or expression of UCP1. They had maximal brown fat activity already, so you weren't going to get an increase by giving them vitamin A, but you certainly saw this with the obese rats. Okay, so with a vitamin A enriched diet over 20 weeks, obese rats had decreased visceral adipose tissue, and this was felt to be due to decreased metabolites from glucocorticoid pathways, right? So that we think that when you give vitamin A to these obese rats, they lose weight because they have more thermogenesis, and also, we are decreasing the activity of the glucocorticoid pathways in those obese rats. It's not so clear what happens in humans. A lot more difficult to study humans than rats, right? So right now where we are is we have, some provocative studies from animal models that seem to suggest that maybe we can impact metabolic health and also obesity via vitamin A. But really we need a whole lot more studies to get the different steps clarified. The main issue with giving vitamin A, now we in the medical world generally will use retinoic acid or retinoids to treat skin conditions or a certain types of cancer, right? So you would generally use synthetic retinoids in those cases. And then the big concern there would be the dyslipidemia that you would see as a result of chronic vitamin A, supplementation. And generally, the most important thing you'll see is increase in the triacylglycerol levels, okay? The tags go up. And this is what is worrisome in those patients. And this is felt to be because of increased liver production of VLDL and also suppression of lipoprotein lipase activity in tissues. So you actually have decreased utilization of triglycerides with that decreased lipase activity, right? So we kind of worry in those patients because you do see the triacylglycerols or the triglyceride levels go up, fairly high. And in addition, some of them will have an increase in HDL levels. Now you might think this is good, but on my episode on HDL, I pointed out that there's a U-shaped curve with HDL, and very low levels of HDL, not good. Very high levels, also not good, all right, in terms of cardiovascular outcomes. And really, HDL is a mixed bag here, not easy to study, but with obese rats, for example, the increased HDL levels were due to decreased expression of those scavenger receptors, SRB1, in the liver. So if you remember from my lipoprotein episode and elsewhere, I do talk about the scavenger receptors here. And this is the main HDL receptor in the liver that takes back cholesterol from HDL, right, in that reverse cholesterol transport system. So we think that there's increased HDL because there's decreased expression of those scavenger receptors in obese rats. And when you gave those obese rats vitamin A, then what happened? We normalized the HDL. Yeah, the HDL actually came down. And at the same time, we saw upregulation of the scavenger receptors, the SRB1 receptor activity in liver. Okay, so it turns out that vitamin A is a positive regulator of the SRB1 gene. So very, very interesting here because we also have, involvement of, your lipid status in your body. Okay, let's do a quick wrap up of what we've discussed so far, and then I'll just give you a little bit on what I think about supplementation with vitamin A. So as I said, we talked about vitamin A as all-trans retinol, and there are generally 3 physiologically active forms: the retinol, retinal, and also retinoic acid. Generally, vitamin A, very, very important in regulation of genes, in immunity, in development, in metabolism. We talked about the difference between retinol esters and beta-carotene in the diet. So if you get your vitamin A from animal sources, let's say liver, animal liver, then it's going to be in the form of retinol esters, so the retinol, combined with fatty acids. Commonly, it's palmitic acid, so you'll have, let's say, retinol palmitate, all right? And that is already in, the active form. That's considered active vitamin A. But if you get it from plant sources, then it's going to be generally in the form of beta-carotene, which is not vitamin A, but a precursor to vitamin A, has to be converted enzymatically into active vitamin A. And absorption is not predictable. It depends on, how you get the beta-carotene, whether it's a mixed diet, whether it's cooked vegetables, whether it's raw. And definitely for absorption, in terms of raw vegetables, you need a pretty good dose of fats along with the consumption of those vegetables in order to increase your absorption there. All right. And then the conversion to vitamin A is, again, unpredictable. It can be, 3-to-1 conversion. It could be a 30-to-1 conversion. It's been as much as 55-to-1, okay? So 55, let's say, micrograms of beta-carotene to 1 microgram of vitamin A. So we really don't know when someone is consuming vitamin A in the form of beta-carotene. We really don't quite know how much active vitamin A that person is getting. So the beta-carotene and retinol esters, the retinol palmitate, they are absorbed in the gut, packaged into chylomicrons, and transported all over the body. When the retinol gets to cells, it really has to be converted to retinoic acid inside the cells so that they can now go to the nucleus and be involved in gene transcription there, okay? And they're stored also in the cells. Primarily, they're stored in the form of these retinol esters in the liver. 80 to 90% of the vitamin A that you have in your body would be stored in these hepatic stellate cells in the liver. And then when, let's say, the rest of your body needs more vitamin A, what you can do is convert the storage form, those esters, back into retinol. And the liver also makes retinol binding proteins. And so the retinol is transported by these retinol binding proteins in complex with something called transthyretin, transthyretin, right? So this big complex moves around in your bloodstream, and we can deliver the vitamin A to different parts of your body there. It turns out we also are able to store vitamin A, in your fat tissue, and the fat tissue is also important in vitamin A homeostasis and metabolism. It actually makes all the machinery involved in vitamin A metabolism, all the enzymes that you need, all the transport proteins that you need. And it seems like, vitamin A is also able to exert its influence on the fat cell, right? And so there's this very tight relationship between vitamin A and the fat cell. And we noticed that with patients with obesity, there's an inverse relationship between the amount of retinol that they have and the BMI. So the more retinol they have, the lower the BMI, and vice versa. We know also that with obesity that, we have increase in production of RBP4 from fat tissue, and this likely has a local effect, something we call a paracrine effect, within the adipose tissue, causing increased inflammation and increased free fatty acids being released in the adipose tissue, which again primes the inflammation there. Okay, so while it may not impact circulating levels of RBP4, the fat tissue certainly has a local effect there with RBP4. And we've seen in animal models, at least with the rat model, that when you have this rat model of obesity and you give those rats vitamin A, we actually decrease weight and those animals lose fat, even though there's no change in the amount of food that they're eating. Okay, we've seen that in those models, we are not really affecting the size or pool of fat cells. In lean rats, the vitamin A, when you give vitamin A in high doses, you have more death of those fat cells. You don't see this in the obese rats. However, what you see in the obese rats is more browning of white adipose tissue. So you have increased UCP1 activity and you have more of this browning of fat, which you don't see in the lean rats, okay? So that might be the advantage, and that might be something that is helping them lose weight. And also there's decreased activation of glucocorticoid pathways in those obese rats, and that's another way that they may be losing fat and therefore losing weight. The main concern with supplementing with vitamin A over long periods of time, chronic supplementation, would be high triglyceride levels, and also maybe HDL levels become too high as well. And there's mostly the high triglyceride levels, right? The HDL actually was only seen in the obese rats, where they had very high HDL levels, and when you gave them vitamin A, the HDL levels dropped because of upregulation of scavenger receptors in the liver that took back the HDL. Okay, but when it comes to the triglycerides, if you have long-term administration of the vitamin A, either in synthetic form or even just regular supplementation, you're going to have high levels of triglycerides, and that is generally what is worrisome in a clinical profile for patients. So people ask me if I supplement my patients with vitamin A. Generally, I do, and I give low dose, in my consideration, the lowest dose of vitamin A. I give it in the active form, so I give it in the form of retinol esters. I don't use beta-carotene, and now you know why, because I really don't know how much vitamin A my patient would be getting if I dosed in terms of beta-carotene, all right? And also, in anyone who's ever had a history of smoking, there's increased risk of lung cancer with administration of beta-carotene. So you do want to worry about that as well. So I don't use beta-carotene. Generally, I have not had problems with dyslipidemia in my patients, but I do pay attention. Periodically, I'll do a metabolic profile. I keep an eye on those liver enzymes. I recently had a patient and I had treated her. She lost weight, she was doing well, and then suddenly one day her liver enzymes went up, and they weren't even that high. It was just a very mild increase, nothing to really kind of, make you shocked or anything. Very mild increase in liver enzymes. And all her doctors said that it was from fatty liver. And I thought, yeah, most of my patients do have some fatty liver, but this was after I had treated her. She lost a ton of weight, right? And I thought, and now her liver enzymes go up. So I actually, to be extra careful, because vitamin A can be liver toxic, I withdrew the vitamin A supplementation in that patient. I just stopped it. I said, don't take that, right? And she had a workup for the increased LFTs or liver function test, and they didn't find anything. And finally, they just said, "Oh, it's a little bit of fatty liver, and that's what you have." And it just never felt right to me. Well, recently she was diagnosed with primary sclerosing cholangitis. So there's backup of bile acids into the liver, which is very toxic to the liver. And this is likely the source of the increased liver function test in that patient. And, when she had the diagnosis of fatty liver, I think most people felt it was okay to put her back on vitamin A. I just had a feeling. And at this point, I just know to trust my feelings when it comes to my patients. I just felt like that's not a good idea, and I withheld the vitamin A, and I will continue to do that in that patient. Likely I will ask her to get her vitamin A from the diet, from animal sources. The other thing you could do if you're going to supplement patients is to just do a once a week dose, low dose, all right? Once a week dose. So even though when you look at the studies, there's not like a lot of vitamin A deficiency in our population here in the US, what you realize is that really less than half the population here has adequate intake of vitamin A. So, there's probably going to be some need for vitamin A supplementation. And again, if you're getting your vitamin A mostly in the form of precursor beta-carotene, then you don't really even know how much vitamin A that person is getting, right? So I'm really, really careful there. And if you're a doctor and you're worried about vitamin A supplementation, yeah, there's a lot of things to consider. And in patients with metabolic disease, there are other reasons for liver dysfunction too. So you don't want to compound possible liver toxicity from high-dose vitamin A with other liver complications, okay? So I would just be extra careful and check those LFTs from time to time. Having said that, I really haven't had a lot of problems with supplementing patients with vitamin A. Okay, so my main point in this episode is really that, those micronutrients are very important in metabolism. So when we are talking about metabolic health, you'll hear people talk about diets and different, maybe macronutrient spreads, but there's really very little discussion about how different micronutrients can contribute to metabolic dysfunction, right? So the moral of the story here is that metabolic health is more than just, macronutrients, and it involves really understanding the nutritional spread here, macro and micronutrients, also immune dysfunction, right? Very important when we're talking about metabolic health. Okay, that's it for my episode on vitamin A. Signing out now from VLMD Rounds. I'm Dr. Vivian Lowe, and I sing the body electric. Bye.